Hello and welcome to this ISIS podcast. I'm Vicky Ellis reporting from autumnal, cool, castle-dotted Budapest for the UEIL Congress, an annual meetup run by the European Lubricants trade body. From electric cars still proving a bone of contention to the skills gap, recruitment, sustainability, and a glimpse into the future with blockchain, we've gone over a lot of ground during this week. And joining us today to talk about it is Peter Vickers, a board member of UEIL and chair and MD of British lubricant business Vickers Oil. Peter, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for inviting me to join you.
And a little bit later we'll be bringing in Sarah Trinderer, my fellow Base Oils Markets editor as well. But first off, Peter, now what did you find the most interesting thing about this skills gap discussion? Because I thought the comment we had on the gender gap was kind of striking, maybe a bit of a suggestion that women don't want to get into the industry. And then obviously Valentina, Sarah Holm of Nina saying, well, her team was, actually almost a little bit had a few more women. And then there was a talk about the ageing workforce and how do we plug that skills gap. So what for you was the most interesting thing that jumped out?
I think there were two things that struck me. The first was the comments from a young person who joined the industry about 5 years ago, who talked about the need to be able to make a difference. That was what had really attracted him to the industry. And he saw that there were three things. They need to be empowered when given a position. They need to be able to apply their personal values. And they need to be encouraged to and given scope to develop their strengths. And together that added up for him for a sense of engagement. And it was that sense of engagement that was the most attractive thing. And that was an important message for us to hear. The second thing was the need for the so-called Generation X to act as mentors for the millennials who are coming in, because the generation above Generation X has retired, has been fended off, at least out of the larger companies.
Maybe that's a call to action from Generation X then. So if we move on to electric cars now, it still seems to be a bit of a daunting, thorny issue for the industry. Whenever you go to a conference, there's always a session on electric cars, often multiple ones. So Sarah, if I can bring you in here, what did you hear this week that really struck you as interesting?
I think we've always kind of heard about the shift to electric vehicles and the fact that if you're going on a purely battery operated vehicle, there's going to be less of a role for lubricants. But something that I think Bill Downey said yesterday during one of the discussions from Novi, he said that actually more lubes are needed for electric vehicles than maybe internal combustion engines, and that the industry really needs to wrap its arms around this change. And I thought that was a really interesting insight, one that I hadn't heard really before. Another kind of interesting thing yesterday was talking about the barriers to the kind of adoption, the widespread adoption of electrified vehicles. I think obviously increased fuel efficiency using highly efficient and high quality lubricants is something that could actually see a slower move towards electric vehicles. And obviously we don't know whether the governments will carry through on these plans that they're announcing. It's all very uncertain, but it was a very interesting discussion.
Plenty of food for thought. Peter, what about you? Do we think the lubes industry is ready to adapt to the EV world?
Well, there was a really systematic presentation by one of the main additive suppliers looking at scenarios and different assumptions about that rate of adoption, which is clearly the key driver. And they're intending to update that as trends actually become reality rather than predictions over the next couple of years, and keep reviewing it. So I think there is great uncertainty, but it's clear that at least some of the major players are making plans which are flexible enough to change as reality unfurls.
Okay, so moving on to one of the next big topics we touched on, sustainability. It's one of those words that kind of gets chucked around, and it can mean so many different things to different people. Somebody earlier called it a Pandora's box. And we also had the UEIL is launching a sustainability task force. So clearly something the industry wants to engage with, kind of get on the front foot, rather than feeling like it's left behind. So Peter, could you tell us a bit about the aim of what the task force is and what the thoughts you've had on what we've heard this week?
The task force is being established fundamentally to tackle that problem of the Pandora's box of what does the definition mean. So the idea is over the next year to get representatives of the whole supply chain, through from base oils and additive companies, through blenders and marketeers, and including even end user customers, to be involved in discussion in order to establish workable definition for what sustainability would mean for the lubricants industry, recognising that may have to vary a bit depending on the application. So the idea is to get people together, not yet in a formal committee that has to work in a certain way, but in a rather practical task force that can set its own rules, come up with some ideas, with the intention of making a formal proposal to the UEIL Board of Directors in about a year's time.
How ready do you think we are to kind of tackle that?
There's been some work done on that in Germany by a body called NASH, which has been a group of, I think, 6 German independent lube manufacturers starting to look at the life cycle analysis and carbon usage and carbon footprint of their own organisations. And I think that's demonstrated, from what I understand of it, some of the difficulties as well as what can actually be made to work. So I imagine the task force will draw on that initial experience and see what can be taken away.
Well, I definitely have to keep an eye on that. That sounds very interesting. Now, looking to the future again, we had a fascinating chat about blockchain. It's one of those sort of buzzwords that crops up a bit like Bitcoin in the market and globally. We had this sort of explanation I found very useful of, blockchain being used as like a digital ledger, and the fact that each piece of information is kind of linked to the other, and that's what gives it a bit of transparency and kind of quality. And I thought it was interesting, though, that the point about making sure it was quality information going into that digital ledger. And we had a bit about how it could be used in the lubricants sector. So what did you take away from that whole piece?
Well, first of all, a feeling of relief that I last understand what it's all about.
I know how you feel.
Apart from that, there was then a discussion about the use of chemical markers in the industry, and clearly that's happening already in some sectors, and you can see it's a good way of challenging counterfeit products. But the presenter himself acknowledged that that's not yet integrated into the blockchain, because it seems that blockchain is best adapted where you've got many parties, many steps and blocks in that chain, and most lubricant supply chains are relatively short, and he was sceptical about whether there'd be the financial merit in doing it, but he could foresee a future, certainly perhaps more on the fuels than the lube side, where it would come. So I think it's something to keep an eye on and see if we're ready for it in a few years' time.
Well, we'll have to keep an eye on that. And in terms of the future, if we bring our eyes a little bit closer to home, to the shorter term, what is your view of the base oils and lubricants market for 2019? Do we have a positive year ahead for the sector? Obviously, it always depends on whether you're a buyer or a seller or a trader as to how you're expecting a year to go. But do you think there's positivity, or is it a bit unknown given there's a lot of change ahead? We have the new ExxonMobil Group 2 plant in Rotterdam in Europe coming up ahead. There's obviously the global trade wars, tariffs, all of this whole big picture stuff that could feed into potential uncertainty. What are your expectations?
Well, I think in addition to all those things you've said, which I completely agree with, there are a couple of extra factors. There's the threat really posed by the IMO 2020 fuel regs, which are going to have an impact on the base oil market as well, indirectly, because of the impact on refineries. There's debate about what that impact's going to be, but it's going to be much larger than I think some people here had recognised. The other one, of course, is the European Parliament elections next year, where there was a forecast that maybe as much as a third of the new MPs will be anti-European from populist movements on both left and right, and that could upset the entire politics of the EU. So I think we're into it for a period of even more uncertainty than usual.
Wow, there's plenty for us to keep on top of then, Sarah, isn't there?
Yes, very much so.
Okay, well, thank you very much both for joining us today. Fascinating to hear your views. And for the listeners, thank you very much for joining us too. Please listen out for the next instalment of the ICIS Europe Chemical Update podcast, or you can, of course, catch all the latest news on the ICIS dashboard. For ICIS here in Budapest, I'm Vicky Ellis.